Still stunned at all of the fallout from the debate the other night. And honestly, I'm just still stunned at all the people who are shocked at Trump's shout out to the white supremacists, telling them to stand down and stand by, and how terrified people are at this, saying this is some new fascism. Really, I know I shouldn't be shocked because I know the actual history of the unconscionable violence that's been committed against the dissenters of the oppressive systems of capitalism and white supremacy in this country that's never been told in history classes that we send our kids to, whether it's public school or private, regular curriculum or advanced placement. And most colleges and universities don't bother with it either. This is why the question about critical race theory and diversity training was actually important. Now, the issue for me isn't whether you agree with critical race theory or not. Rather, the point is to examine the ways in which race, law, and power operate in society. The issue people have with critical race theory is that they think it's divisive, not because it actually is, but because people don't want to examine the history that is at the foundation of the premise of critical race theory, that white supremacy has maintained its power in American society over time through various types of oppression, physical, psychological, even political. And that power dynamic has continued to perpetuate the gross racial stratification that we see today in the widening racial inequality between Black and white Americans in every aspect of society. Now, aside from Trump's ignorant and honestly racist comment that critical race theory itself is racist, there are some weaknesses with it. We have to be honest. The most obvious being, from my perspective, the focus that most people place on only the dynamic between Black and white people in the U.S. and just on the surface, the oppression of the indigenous and toward Mexicans and Asians, as well as LGBTQ people and other oppressed groups, are important discussions in examining the dynamics of power in this country and who has it and who doesn't. And there doesn't seem to be as much focus on the very important issue of class unless the person who's building on critical race theory makes an effort to include it, which isn't always possible, but it should be a part of the power dynamic discussion also. But critical race theory is an important framework from which to view the outcomes of the history the educational institutions in this country choose to ignore. And when we do that, we understand why they ignore it, because the history itself explains that educational institutions in the U.S. perpetuate the very assertion that critical race theory makes, that white supremacy has been upheld over time by various means of oppression by those in power. And who has more power in any society than the people who educate its children? For example, between September 30th and October 1st in 1919, Black farmers met in Elaine, Arkansas to discuss ways to fight for better pay and higher cotton prices. This was obviously after slavery had ended and Black farmers, mostly sharecroppers and tenant farmers, were now trying to make a living for themselves off the crop that made the South one of the richest and most powerful economies in the Western Hemisphere off their free and forced labor for centuries. But instead of paying these experts at cultivating and harvesting this cash crop, those white people who held the power of owning the land refused to pay Black farmers the same for their labor that they paid poor white farmers. Rather than pay a fair market price for cotton, regardless of who was selling it, white people who held the power of the market reduced the price of cotton because they didn't want to pay Black farmers the true market rate. Now, this obviously affected poor white farmers too, as there were white sharecroppers and tenant farmers, but those who had the power of controlling the land and the market were fine with sacrificing the well-being of poor white people so that Black people could not benefit financially. The Progressive Farmers and Housing Union of America was formed to do everything in their power to gain a fair footing in agriculture in a very racially volatile post-World War I era. Now, this organization, the PFHUA, set up shares so members of the organization could buy what they thought would be shares to be invested in real estate because white landowners controlled all of the land. They tried to help sharecroppers and tenant farmers sell their own cotton in the market for their benefit and not just for their landlord's benefit. And they even hired an attorney to sue their landlords for their rightful share of the 1919 cotton crop. This was unionizing. This was organizing among Black sharecroppers, and there were white sharecroppers who joined in this organization too. But these efforts were met with violence from a white mob that did not want to allow the economic independence of those Black laborers and fired upon a church meeting of the PFHUA on the night of September 30th. Black guards returned fire, which resulted in the escalation of violence against the Black farming community in Elaine, Arkansas, with the white mob growing and federal troops joining in hunting down and killing hundreds of Black men, women, and children well into October 1st. The number of people actually killed has never been known. The estimates reach all the way up to 800. Later, after the massacre, in an effort to cover themselves in legality, the white power structure in Elaine organized the Committee of Seven to investigate the incident, which ended up having 122 Black men and women indicted for murder and night riding. That's what the Klan does, but they charged the Black people with it regarding the killing of white people. Not one white person, not even the federal troops or the cops who murdered Blacks were charged with anything. Even the PFHUA's organizer and founder, Robert L. Hill, was charged with manipulating the organization's members into staging an insurrection. Because, we Blacks never know that we're being oppressed until some rabble-rouser from the outside comes along and convinces us that we are, right? Sounds familiar? You see, this is the fascism that we've always lived under in this country, and it's the fascism that regular people don't want to admit has always existed and still matters in what we face now. But how would they know that it has always existed if they've never taught it, as they're taught about the alleged opportunity for all that this country has supposedly always offered? But it is also what people like Trump and his acolytes want to make go away. So they have to characterize talking about this history and teaching it in schools as divisive, because it does indeed expose the pattern and practice of regular, everyday fascism that many in white society have used to maintain power in this country. Now, it has to be noted that it wasn't until the NAACP got involved and won lawsuits that overturned death sentences that were handed down by racist Elaine, Arkansas court proceedings for 12 of the 122 Black defendants that justice ever came for these people. And actually, justice was never really realized. The Arkansas Supreme Court did overturn the sentences for 6 of the defendants, and the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the sentences for the other group of 6 in the case of Moore v. Dempsey, which allowed federal courts to hear and examine evidence in state criminal cases to ensure that defendants had received due process, directly changing the nature of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Not knowing this history erases the critical context around race and power that explains why we're still fighting for our full rights and due process under the law to this day. Until we understand that, we will never see real justice in this country. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.